To me, a good shooter in gaming is what keeps me steeped in the industry. When I look back on the games I've enjoyed the most, a large portion of them are multiplayer-focused first-person shooters. Whether story-based or the aforementioned multiplayer craze, my gaming history is littered with looking down the barrel of a shotgun and aiming at my friends. Heck, recently I've been spending my time on not-so-good shooters, with the repetitive nature of Overwatch 2 drawing me in for some toxic trauma bonding with those I'm playing with. Although the years have certainly blended together the older I get, I think it was the mid-2010s when I first started to notice a real absence from that sort of multiplayer experience. In 2017, when PUBG released, followed by Fortnite, Apex, and countless other Battle Royale games, I especially started to notice there was nothing quite like Halo Slayer to fill the need for a good gaming experience. It was a strange feeling to know that the options for a more classic shooter experience was either the Master Chief Collection or the latest Call of Duty iteration. For a lot of us out there, Battlefield or Warzone seems to fit the need currently. But it doesn't feel like we've, or perhaps it's just I, have found the right shooter for me in a while. And it's not that I have anything against Call of Duty or maybe even a Battlefield here or there, but what I really craved was shooting that just felt good to me. And that has almost always been the Halo franchise, especially Halo 2 and 3. This all slipped away when Halo Infinite came out, and making a change to something as simple as a melee attack ruined everything in the multiplayer experience for most players. I never even ended up finishing the campaign in that game. There have been a few that slipped under the radar for me. A more cooperative experience like Warhammer Vermintide 2 had me in 2024 turning towards bows or magic-based snipers when normally I gravitate towards that up-close and personal combat. The tuning in the game made it feel like I could actually hit the thing I was aiming at, whereas other older school shooters had me frustrated with the admittedly realistic sniper mechanics. I never got good with that sort of combat, and I'll be the first to admit I didn't even try. But it was when Helldivers 2 was shown off, I just kind of said, to the game. Still not that Battlefield Slayer type combat I was seeking. It's just like chaotic, silly, and something I would play with friends eventually, but not right away. When Helldivers 2 launched, I quickly took note of who picked it up out of my social circle and asked them if they'd think I would like it. To my surprise, they mostly just didn't talk the game up. It felt like something that would suit me, but I was almost turned away from Helldivers 2 because I was met with a lot of, I don't know if it's your style of game. I trust my friends and how they interpret the games I like, so I was willing to blindly follow them on the, oh, I wouldn't like it train. Later on, they told me they didn't want to pressure me into getting the game, but they knew I'd enjoy it. I appreciate the respect, but would have liked to have been bullied so I could have made a decision faster. I think it took me about 4 hours on a day off to decide to finally bite the bullet when I could have been enjoying Helldivers 2 from the very start of the gaming session, instead of wiffle waffling while watching countless reviews on YouTube. I've gotten much better since in having faith in Steam's 2-hour return window, even going as far as to purchase Risk of Rain 2 without thinking twice during this last autumn sale. I think Helldivers 2, however, saw one of the biggest needs in the gaming industry and managed to fill it. They saw the need for a shooter that felt good, has multiple different missions, an easy enough progression system, and brought people together in masse. Helldivers 2 throws you right into the action with either an onslaught of Terminids, a bug-like creature that spawns quickly and works to close the gap by keeping you behind cover, or automatons, a distance-based combat that equips your enemies with just as much firepower as that special rocket launcher you called down to use against them. The automatons were met with displeasure when it first launched, with players begging Arrowhead and Sony to recruit the Xbox players and make the game a non-exclusive. What's always interested me about this is that the players didn't ask for the automatons to be easier, for them to be buffed. They just thought that having the former Halo players and Gears of War players might have a better shot at helping them out in the fight for democracy. Helldivers 2 is a chaotic 4-player based combat that requires you to dive into seemingly unbeatable war zones with your comrades. When you first land, it is only a moment of brief respite, say a few seconds, before someone tends to shout out, "They saw me," and all hell breaks loose. The action doesn't stop there, with onslaughts of Terminids or automatons continuing to spawn and chase after the group for the rest of the mission. The idea of success slowly slips through your fingertips as chaos continues to erupt across the battlefield, from both the enemy's firefighting and sometimes their companions' stratagems launching down, conveniently right at your feet. The cooperative firefight doesn't limit you to sticking with your crew, however, with groups quickly fragmenting off from one another in an attempt to get more done on the map by the extraction time. Some players cause problems and run off to complete optional objectives by themselves, destroying spawners, using hell bombs to ruin radio towers, and more. These lone wolf players earned a fast reputation for a bit of mischief amongst the community, but in my experience, they do have the ability to clutch a dicey situation pretty easily, including an extraction. But one of my favorite things is that the developers, Arrowhead Game Studios, had the wisdom to balance this out by making it so you don't have to extract successfully after a mission to it to be considered a win. If the objective is completed, even if Helldivers don't extract, it's still completed. The only punishment received is less monetary rewards overall for the Helldivers on the mission, which, yes, sucks for the players, and it allows the utter chaos of Helldivers 2 to reduce the strain on groups of friends playing. Even if you have 1 or 2 people in the group who care a lot about completing the objective and extracting, hopefully you can just convince them that completing objectives in Helldivers 2 is still considered a win. Oddly enough, this chaotic combat feels like it's enough for me to forget about the need for any sort of deathmatch style combat in the gaming industry. At least it was for this past summer. I'm not saying I spent a huge amount of time on Helldivers 2. There were weeks or months where I didn't touch the game, but the beauty about this new shooter is the core always remains the same, meaning that even after a long period of time, you can still jump back in and pick up right where you left off. It feels like the piece in the shooter community that has been missing for so many years is close to being solved. The only thing I still would like to see is a quicker mode to pop in and out of. But I think that's just me being old and not having enough time for gaming during my working season. That's not necessarily a flaw with Helldivers 2, it's just where I'm at in life. The success of Helldivers 2 can largely be determined by the amount of players they amassed compared to Helldivers 1. But also the fact that Halo Infinite is launching a Helldivers 2 mode for players to keep them playing the latest iteration of the popular Bungie turned 343 turned Halo Studio franchise. For a company as established as Microsoft, the owner of Halo Studios, to take note of Helldivers 2 is an incredible feat for Arrowhead Studios, especially considering Sony owns Arrowhead Studios and it is a PlayStation exclusive nowadays. But the launch didn't go as smoothly as expected. There was a loss of good standing within the gaming community. Unfortunately, Helldivers 2 ended up with a bit of a stain on the release when PlayStation proceeded with an update that would revoke access to several countries. Since the beginning of Helldivers 2, players were aware that they would need to link a PlayStation Network account, eventually. And for most of us, this honestly wouldn't be a problem. The odd thing about the requirement for linking a Sony account is that they chose to sell the game on Steam in countries where PlayStation Network is banned. Even if players wanted to continue accessing the game they purchased on Steam, they wouldn't be able to without using a VPN to create a Sony Network account somewhere else and link accounts. I'm fairly certain this enters into a morally grey area for players in those countries, and it certainly was unethical of Sony to allow the game to be listed in those countries on Steam. A lack of foresight is the best way to describe these actions from Sony. However, Sony did announce in May that they would not be proceeding with the update, and we're still learning what is best for PC players. While I don't fully believe Sony feels this way and would rather just push PlayStation Network onto PC players, I also really like the way that they dealt with the situation. With enough pushback, people were saying they didn't want to play or support the game anymore. They quickly changed the outcome of that patch. The phrase "speak with your wallet" comes to mind when I think back on the situation. That wasn't the end of the PlayStation drama though, as an EULA update links to PlayStation's website directly versus having a written one out in the game. Arrowhead Studios also had to deal with Valve updating the EULA for the Steam platform itself, which clarifies that you do not own the game, only the digital access to the games purchased via Steam. This isn't a new thing or anything that really needs to be reported on by these news outlets, but it does clarify for a few states in the US where this would be a problem, most notably California starting next year. Helldivers 2 has made the press circuits for drama more than twice though, with Forbes reporting on the latest update from Arrowhead Games. The patch Enduring Freedom, which was the biggest Helldivers 2 update to date, barely increased player numbers. Over 30,000 players playing consistently is still a lot of gamers, but it's unfortunate that the game hasn't received the continued player base it can clearly support. Okay, aside from the beginning days of Helldivers 2 when it was so popular that you couldn't connect. But hey, once they got that sorted out, the game is meant for a large community. According to Forbes, players are upset that Arrowhead has once again taken to nerfing popular weapons and strategies, something they previously said they would not be doing as much. But they have nerfed fire-based weapons including the flamethrower itself, and many anti-bug loadouts have been crippled as a result. Some players theorize that this was done to encourage purchase of the fire-based war bond that has just been released with this update. The war bonds, or battle passes, in Helldivers 2 cost about $10 each. But it isn't just about this potentially being a stealth pay-to-win injection from Arrowhead Studios, it's a lack of content in the major update, as well as the continuing nerfs to weapons that the community is gravitating towards using in the ongoing fight for democracy. It's unfortunate when in a player versus environment situation like this, or PvE, rebalancing weapons so that all stratagems would be viable is not a bad idea. It's okay to want players to feel like they can use whatever they want and enjoy the game in their way without one being much more powerful than the other. When a meta takes over, it's not long before random lobbies you join will start getting upset at you for not using what is most powerful. This happens less and less with games with short-term missions, say the 50 minutes of Helldivers 2, but it's still an issue you can run into with online communities. People freaking suck. That's not up to the developers to control, but I think they can help out a little bit. And honestly, it's unfortunate at how quickly Arrowhead Games broke the trust of players with this new major update. Especially given that an article posted on September 27, 2024 at VG247 has a screenshot of a developer on Discord talking about how the mood at Arrowhead Studios has greatly improved following the uptick in numbers of players exploring the new patch content. It's hard not to feel like you're regaining the trust of a community and feel like the studio is turning things around when you see an increase in players following new content. Reading the perception of community on your studio without a metric like how many people are playing is incredibly difficult for a developer, especially one knee-deep in continuing content updates for players. And I don't think that Arrowhead has lost its reputations with players at large permanently or for very long. Although it is an uphill battle, I think that Arrowhead Studios will be one of the rarest things we've ever seen in gaming. They've got the opportunity to restore the faith a community has in them. Not just the players continually fighting for democracy, but the gaming industry as a whole. Which brings us to rebuilding trust after playing Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. I'm sorry, what? Does anyone else remember the campaign in 2010 when Ubisoft put multiplayer in Assassin's Creed for the first time? It was a new venture in one of the many kooky multiplayer modes of the time. BioShock 2 had a multiplayer mode that had players battling it out as either a big daddy or a splicer, and Assassin's Creed was the latest one to join the foray. I can still picture it pinned to my parents' bulletin board in the kitchen, and while I'm not exactly at home to go and take a look and verify it's there, I'm sure if I had video called my mom, she would have dug it out for me and shown me, so thanks, Mom, for the hypothetical support. It took me a few Google searches to bring up the right results, but the pamphlet walks you through a few steps. Admitting you have a problem, kill them with kindness and weapons, is it still friendly fire if you use a knife, but most importantly, the road to recovery. While this isn't all applicable to the current state of Helldivers 2 and how Arrowhead Game Studios has broken trust with gamers, one point really stands out to me in terms of how gamers tend to react in the situation we found ourselves in. We have all been tempted from time to time to slash at the forbidden fruit that is your teammate's carotid artery, but a little tenderness and understanding goes a long way towards keeping your team members' blades pointed towards those who deserve it. I wonder if in a situation like Helldivers 2 and Arrowhead Game Studios, we are pointing the blade at the wrong person for most of this. While I won't go as far to say that Arrowhead is a perfect studio, I implore you to give grace to the studio considering Helldivers 2 is the most sold game by far for this company. We are not talking small increases. Gauntlet Slayer Edition sold anywhere between 650,000 to 2.43 million units, Magicka sold 2.2 million, Helldivers sold 4 million, and Helldivers 2 sold 12 million. What I love about Arrowhead Game Studio is they seem to have an openness to holding themselves accountable for bad situations they found themselves in. Whether this is a situation they've caused, Sony has caused, or Steam has caused, they're willing to take accountability. Even when PlayStation required a PlayStation Network account to be linked to continue playing the game, the company still said something regarding it. And we all know that they would have agreed to this, but I don't fault the company for not noticing the publisher had pushed the game into countries that wouldn't be able to connect to a PlayStation Network ID. Arrowhead Game Studio does not do what most companies will. There isn't a brushing under the rug of the mistakes that they have been caused by development choices along the way. There is clear communication from the company, and it always seems to line up with, we can do better. Part of the human experience is making mistakes. We all fumble, and thankfully enough for most of us, we don't have enough weight on our shoulders to be held to the severity of consequences that we tend to hold studios like Arrowhead Games at. There is no large group of players experiencing our content, and knowing that one small choice can determine whether or not someone will continue playing the game. This lack of desire to understand intent from developers or publishers is one of the worst choices in the gaming community as a whole. On one final note, I find the most interesting parallel within Helldivers 2 in the way that the community interacts with the developers. There's a developer given the reign to kind of help balance flights, see what's going on within matches, and create different scenarios for players. This developer is lovingly known as Joel, and there's a constant dance with Helldivers and Joel to gain democracy. This has almost crossed over into the real world in a sense, with the way that the community fights the developers at Arrowhead in terms of new updates, roadmaps, and content for the game. This fight for democracy has spread to the real world for a lot of players. It feels like the Helldivers 2 content roadmap is not players celebrating continued content and developers continuing to provide, but instead becoming a constant battle of back and forth with one another. Although we can all share ideas of how we'd like games to play out, there's very rarely an idea that every player will say, "I love this and cannot wait to see it in a game." You can't make everyone happy, can you? My hope for Arrowhead Game Studios, for Helldivers 2, and for the players still fighting for democracy is that we find common ground where we can. I'm not saying to avoid holding companies responsible. Anyone who knows me knows that I am the first to call out unjustified actions. But I do want us to remember that on the other side of the screen, the developers have lives, feelings, and are likely entering dedicated crunch times to try and bring us more content rapidly. This happens again and again and again. It's not a pretty industry, and employees are currently fighting for their lives amid massive layoffs. We've never seen it like this before. The amount of stress that comes from being in a small studio in such unstable times is not to be underestimated. And it wouldn't surprise me to hear that the devs at Arrowhead Studios are worried about being shut down constantly. Excuse my hyperbolic language for a moment, but if a critically successful game like Hi-Fi Rush can have Tango Studios shuttered quickly after release, what's preventing Helldivers 2 from being shut down months after release? My name is Alana, and you've been listening to Beyond the Button Mash. Be sure to subscribe on YouTube or on most major podcasting platforms like iTunes or Spotify for future episodes. Thank you for listening.